Hello everyone, Daniel from Spacedock here, and I've just watched the conclusion of the 7th season of Star Wars The Clone Wars, the big wrap-up series that they did, and I thought it was excellent, and I want to talk about it. So there's going to be full spoilers here, just to be warned, because I'm going to go into detail with the whole season. Okay, first up we had the Bad Batch arc. This whole season was split into 3 4-part arcs, and the first of those was the Bad Batch. Now this did not in the least bit feel like a big grandiose return for Clone Wars after the big massive absence that it's had for all this time. It very much felt like just tuning in after it had been a week since the last episode. It was just more normal Clone Wars, which I thought was a kind of weird experience at first. Bad Batch is definitely my least favourite of the 3 arcs in this season, and I think a lot of the stuff that happens in Bad Batch is undercut by the fact that it is so close to the end, because obviously it's resolved with Echo being brought back and then him being taken away to join the Bad Batch, and that all feels a little bit flat and pointless knowing that Order 66 is going to happen in like 2 weeks, so none of that resolution really means anything. I also, to be frank, found the Bad Batch themselves to be kind of grating and annoying. They were basically just a sort of gaggle of walking cliches, and the Republic already has like 15 different kinds of Special Forces unit, and I'm not sure it needed more, especially given what happens later in the season. I think I would have appreciated more of Jesse and Kix and Cody instead of these new characters for this short time. But for a final kind of Republic versus Separatists arc for the Clone Wars, it was pretty great. It wrapped up Admiral Trench, it brought back Echo with a little bit of interesting dynamic there, and we had Rex dealing with the implications of the whole war. Easily my favourite scene in this arc was the whole sequence where Rex is watching out for Anakin while he talks to Padme, and we get confirmation that, of course, Obi-Wan is keenly aware of the whole Padme thing and is just going along with it. There's a lot of symbolism tied into a very small scene there where it's like Rex's undying loyalty to Anakin, Obi-Wan's complete understanding and wisdom of the situation and just acceptance of it all. It really is just this melancholy kind of slice of life of what these people have come to mean to each other and what dynamic they've established over all this time. So if nothing else, that was really great. Second arc was Ahsoka and the Martez sisters. I thought this started out really, really strongly. I loved all of the Coruscant stuff, and I think we really needed an Ahsoka kind of intimate personal arc, and these 2 characters they introduced were a good way of communicating that. Ahsoka is very much the protagonist of Star Wars The Clone Wars, and getting to see some of her independent acting out here when she's left the Order was very, very interesting. This arc did fall into a trap that Clone Wars falls into a little too often, where we get almost entire episodes of just action and running down hallways. I get that it's an action show, and it's very frenetic and sort of, it's got an audience of younger viewers, and it needs to be very action-packed, but sometimes it will do that way to the detriment of any kind of dialogue or characterization, and you'll get very, very overextended scenes of action, and some of the middle parts of that Ahsoka arc when they were in the prison really did drag that out quite a bit. But overall, it was very solid. Now, the one thing I do wonder is whether or not having these 2 arcs, which did have their pros and cons in of themselves, was a good idea compared to simply releasing the Siege of Mandalore as its own thing. Because I have to wonder how many viewers sort of turned off or lost attention halfway through, because it is very normal, and the Siege of Mandalore is very, very not. The big epic wrap-up reboot feeling only arrives at the start of the Siege of Mandalore, which makes me kind of wonder whether it would have been more effective as a simply one piece of storytelling, maybe as a movie on Disney Plus or whatever. But either way, this is when it really became emotional and really investing. So the entire 4-part Siege of Mandalore arc crosses over with Revenge of the Sith, which is my favourite Star Wars movie. I love it to bits. And the feeling of importance and dread in the situation in knowing what's happening is done really well. This is the best thing to do with prequels. Prequels are so hard to do. It's so easy to lose any kind of investment because people know what's going to happen. But in this case, they used the fact that the audience knows what's coming to create this sense of dread. And when Obi-Wan runs in and says that the Capitol has been attacked and the Chancellor has been kidnapped and they've got to go, you know exactly what's happening. And it is incredibly intense. Really, really good stuff. We have the wonderful sequence of half of the 501st Legion becoming the 332nd and getting the Ahsoka-style painted clone helmets, which in the moment is a really, really excellent scene that's very heartfelt and shows this kind of loyalty they've all built for her, even though she's not a Jedi anymore. Even if it was just on its own, it would be perfect. But this pays off so much when Order 66 happens further down the line, and I'll talk about that more in a second. Rex also gets promoted to Commander, which is great. He's got an entire Clone War of just sort of carrying everything on his shoulders, and he finally gets some recognition for it, even if it is just as a loophole so Anakin can give his friend some soldiers. But either way, they're off to Mandalore to deal with Maul, who was very much one of the major antagonists of Clone Wars, and again, the show is really delineating it down to its characters, Ahsoka, Maul, and Rex, which were the kind of trinity of Clone Wars in of itself. Anakin and Obi-Wan get to go off and have their own story and be part of the saga where it is their story, and we get to see what's going on with these other characters that we've grown to care about. There's a genius sequence where they are coming into Mandalore in Republic gunships, and the music is mirrored against the music from the beginning of Revenge of the Sith during the space battle, kind of implying that these events are happening at exactly the same time, which is really, really exciting. And the story continues to pick up on that. There's lots of points where Obi-Wan will check in with Ahsoka. He tells her that Count Dooku is dead, and he's on his way to Utapau, and you know that this call is happening in the middle of Revenge of the Sith, and it fits perfectly, and it's so well done. And the best example of that, I think, was when they have the group conference for I Sense a Plot to Destroy the Jedi, which is actually a scene from Revenge of the Sith. And then after it cuts away in the movie, we see Ahsoka join that conversation in the show. And that's the kind of thing where, on paper, you think this is just like a cliche, fan-service-y kind of deal to tie it in directly like that. But it works so well, it's completely believable. And it also hits so much harder because you know that Mace Windu is going to head off and get killed 5 minutes later. 5 minutes after he's just palmed off Ahsoka for not being a Jedi and lost out on the information she had that may well have saved his life. Again, just tying into the whole prequel era's continuous themes about the Jedi's arrogance and cluelessness and hypocrisy. Really brilliantly done. The second part of the Siege of Mandalore arc also gives us easily the best lightsaber duel in the entire Clone Wars series, which they brought in Ray Park, the original actor for Darth Maul from The Phantom Menace, to do the mocap for Maul, and they had an excellent stuntswoman do the mocap for Ahsoka. It was really well choreographed, it looked fantastic, the music was great, and it was definitely the visual high point of this kind of 4-part conclusion. Another fantastic thing they did here was that Maul's objective is to stop the events of Episode 3, and we know how bad that is. We know all of Palpatine's plans, and Maul has more details. Incidentally, he's able to see in the Force a lot of Palpatine's plan simply because he is a Dark Jedi. He's not having his view of the future obscured by the dark side because he is the dark side. So he's kind of a loophole in of himself from Palpatine's point of view. There's not as much he can do about him. So we get to watch our heroes try to stop Maul from preventing the catastrophe that we know is coming. And they succeed. They arrest him and stop him. And as he's being dragged away, he's screaming, "You're all going to burn, you're all going to die," because he knows what's going on. And we've just watched the last chance for any kind of salvation from this be heroically defeated, and it's just a fantastic subversion. It's really, really well done. Incredible voice acting from Sam Witwer, incredible voice acting from everyone. Ashley Eckstein, D. Bradley Baker continuing to play 100 different clones, all with incredibly distinct personalities. Really fantastic. But then when it really gets serious is when we get to Shattered, the second to last episode, which is, of course, when it finally happens and Order 66 comes down. Now, the conclusion of this arc was a little bit more focused than I was expecting it to be, in ways that I'm not hugely happy about. For one thing, we never got any kind of explanation for how Wolf and Gregor removed their inhibitor chips, which we know happens from Star Wars Rebels. And also, because it was entirely set aboard this Venator in a very short amount of time, we missed out on some kind of grander scope of what was going on with Order 66. One thing I've always wanted is a Rex and Cody confrontation, where Cody is brainwashed and Rex is not, and he's desperately pleading with him to try and get him to understand, and it's completely in vain, because those two were like closest friends in the beginning of the series and all that, and it also would have given us a bit more wrap-up for Cody after Utapau. I thought that at some point they might do that in Rebels, and they never did, which made me think maybe they'd been saving it for this, and then it still didn't happen, which is a real shame. But either way, Order 66 happens, and it's just perfectly done. We get all of the horrible, foreboding vision of what's happening for Ahsoka, where she hears the lines from Episode 3 with Palpatine and Anakin. And then we get this absolutely heartbreaking moment of Rex just trying to control himself for 2 seconds while he's being forced to do this. His helmet is shaking in his hand and he has tears in his eyes, and he just about manages to tell her to look up the information about fives before he snaps. And this is when the painted helmets idea really comes into its own, because now we have 2 episodes of these clone troopers that we've loved for years, all of these poor people, pawns in somebody else's game this whole time. They're relentlessly hunting this woman through this ship whilst wearing helmets painted in honor of her, that they painted themselves like yesterday, and they haven't even had time to remove them, and they haven't thought to. All of that love and loyalty that made them do that is gone and just replaced with this merciless instinct to kill her, and they're doing it completely coldly and emotionlessly, and it's just so sad. It's just this perfect tragic image all the way through both episodes. It manages to communicate all of the victimhood of the clones without any words so well. So many of these clones we see learn to value themselves from the Jedi. There are early episodes in the first and second seasons of the show where clones themselves are saying, "We're just clones, we're just expendable." And characters like Plo Koon and Anakin and such have to say, "No, you're not. you're people, you're valuable, you're worthwhile. And in the end, they are compelled against their will to murder these people who valued them more than they valued themselves. And it's just incredibly painful to sit through, and all of the emotionality is really on point. It's just perfectly depicted. Ahsoka, of course, manages to figure out what's going on with the inhibitor chips from the information, and Rex has his chip removed. He's then forced to kill some of his clone brothers in defense of Ahsoka, and we tie it into the old Fives plot from the previous season, just to explain that Rex is now certain that this is the whole Grand Army of the Republic and he knows what's going on. And we move into the final episode. Now, for me, I think this last episode was probably the weakest of the four for the finale. It was shorter than I think it should have been, and it was a little too action-focused for what it was meant to be doing. It was essentially just a practical depiction of them escaping the Star Destroyer and faking their deaths and surviving, basically. It didn't take anywhere near as much time as I think it should have to actually muse on the situation with Order 66. There's the confrontation between Rex and Jesse, which could have been so powerful. It could have been Rex desperately trying to plead with this guy, his friend, desperately trying to get him to understand, and there's just no hope. He can't be reasoned with. He's completely under the control of this chip in his head, and there's nothing that can be done, and perhaps Rex is forced to kill him or something. Instead, we got this kind of fake-out negotiation thing. Rex accepts the situation very quickly with Order 66. There's not really much conflict there, which I think is a shame, and it's mostly just an action sequence of them escaping the Star Destroyer. In the end, everything's wrapped up with Maul and all that, and we get this fantastic melancholy sequence at the end where we see Vader an indeterminate amount of time in the future, examining the wreckage and looking at his apprentice's old lightsaber and all that he's left behind, and we see finally it ends on the image of the Ahsoka painted helmet, which I think is perfect. It's probably the most symbolic object that has been created for the entire Clone Wars series. It just says so much in of itself. Perfectly done. I would have appreciated a longer fourth part to this finale, perhaps a little bit of a wider scope to have some kind of a montage so we can see stuff with Commander Wolffe and Gregor and how they've dealt with that, and the aftermath of Plo Koon's death. There is no mention of Plo Koon, despite him being the guy who raised Ahsoka, which seems a little bit weird. And also some of the characters like Cody kind of got left out, just because there wasn't enough time for them all. But really, that is just a screen time issue. I think what was done with the available time made sense. And honestly, I'm just extremely grateful that they made this conclusion. Like, Clone Wars never really got the wrap-up it was meant to. It was cancelled out of nowhere. And honestly, Captain Rex, Ahsoka Tano, these stories that later got brought into Rebels and are now being brought into The Mandalorian and all this Filoni chunk of Star Wars, it's easily the best part of the IP for the past, 10 years, right? There's no question there. There's so much more going on in this part of Star Wars than there is in the rest of it, and it feels like the gulf increases with every year. The Filoni stuff just gets better, and the rest of it just gets worse every single year. It's this kind of stuff that makes me lament the big, powerful return of Star Wars with The Force Awakens and the new trilogy and everything. Because I remember when this started out, when Clone Wars, right before the buyout from Disney, Clone Wars was the biggest Star Wars thing that was happening, and it had been kind of downsized as an IP. Star Wars wasn't as big as it used to be, so it allowed something like Clone Wars to really get the attention it deserved. And I feel like the writers involved in Clone Wars and in all of the other ancillary books and materials before Disney came along sort of felt like they had more freedom and control over the property than maybe they do now. There was more room to be appreciative of something like Clone Wars and how it thoughtfully approached the existing material. Before, we lived in a world where Kylo Ren's face is on packets of yogurt in the shop. The saturation is just at its maximum now. You'll notice that I haven't made a Star Wars video in 4 months, because I just did that thing about The Rise of Skywalker after it came out, and I was just exhausted with it all. I mean, I don't mean to jump on the bandwagon of not liking all that stuff, and I think the sequel trilogy has a lot of pros to it, a lot of advantages, and there's some good storytelling in there, and I'd never want to diminish any writer's meaningful effort to contribute to a science fiction property. But the saturation and the exhaustion and the feeling of kind of by-the-numbers storytelling is just exhausting. And to just see something wrapped up that clearly had so much love put into it and always had done, to have all of its themes about loyalty and self-worth finally realized in this fantastic way at the end. Clone Wars really was something special, and it deserves to be as beloved as it is by so many Star Wars fans. So really, a tip of the hat to Dave Filoni for creating a situation where I am massively exhausted with Star Wars to the point where I have no interest in consuming any of it, but if you put Ahsoka Tano or Captain Rex in it, I'll be up at 4 a.m. to watch it. That's something of an achievement, and I think he deserves more than a small amount of respect for that. So from 2008 to now, thank you for a fantastic series, and this is Daniel from Spacedock, signing off. Thank you for watching Spacedock. If you're interested in supporting the channel, please do check out the links on the screen right now or in the description below for our Patreon and channel membership services. Anything you can pledge goes towards improving our team and our equipment and allowing us to put together bigger and more exciting video projects for you guys on the channel.